So what happens when a deadly new disease breaks out? We race for cures, we try to contain it, but we're also forced to make some truly impossible choices. To really get our heads around this, we're going to go back to the 2014 Ebola outbreak in West Africa. It was a crisis that showed the whole world just how unprepared our ethics were for a modern plague. And to see where things went wrong, we have to start with the virus itself.
Okay, first things first, let's talk about just how terrifying this virus is. A 50% average case fatality rate. In some outbreaks, it's been as high as 90%. I mean, think about that. That's not just a statistic, it's basically a coin flip for survival. And that number, right there, set the stage for all the desperation and fear that was about to unfold.
So, how did the world respond? Well, this quote from public health expert Lawrence Gostin is just chilling. He said the response, these cordon sanitaires, were basically medieval tactics, the same kind of thing they did during the Black Death. Here we are in the 21st century, and the go-to strategy was to seal off entire communities. It just goes to show you how quickly our modern systems can fall apart.
Right, so to really grasp the ethical mess that this created, we first have to understand the crisis itself. This wasn't just about a virus. No, this was a perfect storm of biology, of social issues, and political failures that all came together to create an absolute catastrophe.
So what is Ebola? Well, it's sneaky. It starts out looking a lot like the flu. You know, fever, fatigue, but then it progresses into something truly horrific. The body's core functions start to break down, your organs fail, and in the worst cases, it leads to devastating internal and external bleeding.
Now, this is super interesting because Ebola actually has a couple of, saving graces, if you can even call them that. First, and this is huge, it's not airborne. It spreads through direct contact with bodily fluids. And second, this is absolutely crucial. A person is only contagious after they start showing symptoms. So in theory, that should make it way easier to contain than something like the flu or a cold.
So if it's theoretically containable, why was the 2014 outbreak so catastrophic? Well, this slide shows you exactly why. It was the absolute perfect storm. See, the virus didn't just appear in a sterile lab. It landed in countries where healthcare systems were already broken and totally underfunded. That created this massive vacuum of trust, which was immediately filled with fear and misinformation. And that fear just got worse when the military, not doctors, showed up on the streets. Add to that deeply held traditions, like burial practices where families touched the deceased, and suddenly moments of grief became moments of mass transmission. It was a total systems failure.
And this perfect storm? It forced doctors, governments, and health organizations to face choices that were just impossible. When every option looks bad, what in the world is the right thing to do? It all boiled down to two massive ethical questions that had no easy answers. Here's the first huge dilemma. There were these experimental drugs, like ZMapp, that seemed promising, but they'd never actually been tested on people. So imagine you have a patient with a 50-50 chance of dying. Is it ethical to offer them a potential cure that could also have totally unknown, maybe even dangerous side effects? You're pitting this desperate hope for survival against the most fundamental rule in medicine: first, do no harm. And then there's this. To stop the virus from spreading, authorities fell back on those medieval quarantines, locking down entire neighborhoods. But in doing that, they often cut people off from food, water, and even basic medical care for other illnesses. So, is it right to sacrifice the well-being and the freedom of some for the potential safety of everyone else?
Okay, so faced with these just awful situations, bioethicists and doctors realized we needed something more than just medicine. We needed a clear ethical toolkit, a framework we could use to make principled decisions instead of just panicked ones in the heat of the moment.
The first tool in this kit is pretty straightforward. It's called the harm principle, and it's basically the green light for doing anything at all. It says you can only limit someone's freedom, like forcing them into quarantine, if there's a clear and obvious danger that they will harm other people. With a deadly and contagious disease like Ebola, this principle gives you the fundamental justification for taking action in the first place.
Next up, you've got proportionality, and this one is really just about common sense. Don't use a sledgehammer when a scalpel will do the job. You have to use the least restrictive, least invasive measures that will still be effective. So you would try, say, voluntary isolation before you enforce a mandatory lockdown. The response has to fit the scale of the threat. Now this might be the most important tool in the whole kit, reciprocity. The idea here is that public health is a two-way street. It's a social contract. If society asks you to make a sacrifice for the greater good, like staying home in quarantine, then society has a moral duty to support you with food, with healthcare, and even with money to make up for lost wages. This is the direct answer to why those medieval cordons failed so badly.
And finally, transparency. This is the glue that holds the whole thing together. People need to understand why these drastic measures are being taken. The rules have to be clear. The reasons have to be public. Remember all that distrust we talked about? Well, transparency is the antidote. It's the only way you can build the public trust that you absolutely need for any of this to work.
So we have our 4 principles: harm, proportionality, reciprocity, and transparency. But here's the really brilliant part about this toolkit. It's not a one-size-fits-all solution. The answers it gives you depend entirely on the biological reality of the specific disease you're dealing with.
And this table just lays it out perfectly. Let's walk through it. For Ebola, highly fatal, spreads through bodily fluids, a forced quarantine is justified if you also meet the reciprocity principle. You've got to support those people. Now, what about tuberculosis? It's airborne, can be fatal, so maybe quarantine is justified, but only in very specific cases. But the common cold? It's airborne, but it's not lethal. A forced quarantine would be a massive overreaction. It completely fails the proportionality test. See how it works?
And that's the core takeaway right there. We don't need a different set of morals for every new virus that comes along. What we need is one consistent ethical framework that we can apply to the specific facts of each disease, how deadly it is, how it spreads. The framework stays the same. It's the biological inputs that change.
So all of this brings us to today and to the future. Because the lessons from the Ebola crisis aren't just about Ebola. They're about getting ready for the next inevitable pandemic. And they teach us that being ethically prepared is every bit as important as being scientifically prepared.
So what did we learn, really? The lessons are pretty stark. First, a weak health system anywhere is a threat to people everywhere. Second, preparedness isn't just a nice idea, it's literally everything. Third, you simply cannot win without community trust. But the biggest lesson of all is that controlling a pandemic isn't just a medical problem to be solved. It is a deeply complex ethical challenge.
And that leaves us with one final, pretty heavy thought. We all know another pandemic is coming. It's not a question of if, it's only a question of when. And while the scientists are racing to prepare the vaccines and the treatments, the real question is for the rest of us. When it gets here, will we have done the hard work to make sure our ethics are ready for the impossible choices that we know are coming?